In this session, we will discuss the structure and themes of the Old Testament. First, we'll examine the structure of the Old Testament, and then we'll look at the four themes. First of all, let's look at the structure. The Bible is divided into two sections called testaments. The Hebrew word berith lies at the basis of this word testament, and literally in Hebrew it means covenant, agreement, treaty, or arrangement between two parties. It signifies and defines a relationship. Testament is an unfortunate translation of this word berith. In English, a testament is a declaration, as in last will and testament, and the Hebrew term is not used this way. The Hebrew term is much more relational, so in the Bible we have the old relationship, which is composed of books Genesis through Malachi, and then we have the new relationship, which begins in Matthew and goes all the way through to the book of Revelation. Let's talk about the basic themes. The first theme that I'm suggesting to you is the theme of election. Now, when we talk about election, we are not talking about voting for a candidate. If we were to define it, we would say that election is God's choice of a person or people for a special purpose. Let me give you some scripture references here. In terms of choosing a person, we could point to Genesis 12:1, where God chose Abraham. As a nation, the nation of Israel was chosen in Exodus 6:7, which says, "I will take you as my people." God speaks there and says, "I will take Israel as my people." And then also in Exodus 19:5 through 6, which God addresses Israel and says to Israel, "You shall be my treasured possession, a priestly kingdom, and a holy nation." So those three things were very important in terms of what Israel was chosen for, in terms of that special purpose. First of all, they were chosen to be a treasured possession. The word segula that lies at the basis for the word treasured possession in Hebrew literally means the private property of a king. Israel was also designated to be a priestly kingdom. The job of a priest was to mediate between God and humanity. So Israel was chosen as a special nation to stand between God and humanity, to call humans into a relationship with God. Thirdly, Israel was called to be a holy nation. They were to be set apart. There were certain things that God wanted to accomplish in history among humanity, and Israel was that nation through which God would establish something called the line of Messiah. So Israel was God's chosen people. The chosen people were given promises, privileges, and responsibilities. They were promised God's protection and provision. Of course, God promised that He would protect Israel from hostile nations and from those who were seeking to encroach on their boundaries and take their freedom away from them. God also promised to provide for them. Later on, we will see in the book of Deuteronomy how God promised that if the Israelites would keep the covenant, that He would send the rain at the proper time so that their crops would grow and therefore that they would not starve to death. So God promised protection and provision. God also promised privilege. These two privileges were the revelation of God. In other words, God would reveal His purposes to them. And secondly, that God would live among them. They would have the presence of God in their midst. That's really what the tabernacle was all about. When we get to the book of Exodus, we'll discuss the tabernacle in more detail. Thirdly, the Israelites had responsibilities as the chosen people. And what they were responsible to do was to be faithful to the covenant and keep the law. Through the chosen people, something called the line of Messiah was established. I mentioned that a while ago, and now let's talk about it in a little more detail. God began by choosing one person, and that one person was Abraham. This one person would eventually lead to one nation, and that one nation, of course, was the nation of Israel. Out of that one nation, one tribe was selected, and that one tribe was the tribe of Judah. Now, among the tribe of Judah, God had to choose one family through which the Messiah would come. So we have one family, and who do you think that one family might have been? Well, if you said David, you were correct. And then out of that one family, one person was selected, and that one person, who was the Messiah, was, of course, Jesus. But God started all the way back with Abraham, establishing the line of Messiah, and through history, throughout the centuries, that line of Messiah was protected and preserved until they got down to the one person who would be the Messiah, and that person was Jesus. Now that we've talked about the theme of election, let's talk about the second theme, which is covenant. If we were to define the term covenant, we would say that a covenant was a bond between God and people that united them in mutual obligation. The covenant was based on God's initiative. God chose Israel and not the other way around. And here I can point you toward Deuteronomy 7, verses 7 through 11 is the whole passage, but I'm just going to read to you verses 7 and 8. It was not because you were more numerous than any other people that the Lord set his heart on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all peoples. It was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath that he swore to your ancestors, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So you see, it was God's choice of Israel to be in a covenant relationship, and it was not Israel's choice. The covenant made moral demands on the chosen people, and this was in sharp contrast to the surrounding nations and cultures. In the ancient Near East, law was not based on morals or justice. It was primarily meant to keep order in society. So Israel's covenant was a covenant that made moral demands on the chosen people, unlike the surrounding cultures. Thirdly, in regards to the covenant, a holy God required his people to reflect his character both in worship and in morals. Now we move to the third major theme of the Old Testament, and I'm suggesting to you that the third major theme of the Old Testament is that of law. The Torah, or the Pentateuch, contains several subunits of legal material. I hope you understand what we're talking about when we refer to the Torah or the Pentateuch. Torah is the Hebrew term that usually refers to the first 5 books of the Bible, and Pentateuch is another term that has the same reference. So the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are called either the Torah or the Pentateuch. The Torah or the Pentateuch contains several subunits of legal material. The first subunit is the Book of the Covenant. That's found in Exodus 19 through 24. The Book of the Covenant was given at Mount Sinai. It includes the 10 Commandments and many other laws that regulated social practices. The second subunit of legal material that we're going to look at briefly is the Holiness Code, and that's found in Leviticus chapters 17 through 26. The dominant theme here in the Holiness Code is that Israel must be holy because Yahweh is holy. Rather than social behavior, the Holiness Code focused on worship guidelines. Then the third subunit of legal material that we're going to examine very briefly is the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are found in 2 places in the Torah. First of all, in Exodus 20, which was given at Mount Sinai, and also Deuteronomy chapter 5. Deuteronomy chapter 5 is an expanded version given by Moses to the next generation before they entered the land of Canaan. Now, how did the Old Testament law contrast with ancient Near Eastern law codes? I'm going to suggest to you 3 comparisons or contrasts between the law of Moses and ancient Near Eastern law codes. First of all, there was uncompromising monotheism on the part of the Old Testament law. Yahweh had no pantheon or consort, in contrast with other societies. Do you know those terms? Do you know what a pantheon was? For example, if you've ever had Greek mythology, Zeus was the head of the pantheon, and there were many other Greek gods and goddesses, and they were part of the pantheon. They were members of the divine assembly, and so Zeus, head of the pantheon in the Greek method of worship. A consort was essentially a partner or a wife or a spouse. Yahweh had neither of these. There was no Israelite pantheon, nor did Yahweh have a wife. There was no Mrs. God. And that's unlike the other societies in that day and time. For example, in Egypt, the chief god was Re, who was the sun god, and of course there were dozens of Egyptian gods and goddesses that made up the pantheon of Egypt. In Mesopotamia, the chief god was Marduk, his consort was named Ishtar, and there were a great many gods and goddesses in the Mesopotamian pantheon. In Canaan, Baal was the chief god, and consort was named Athtar, and there were many gods in the Canaanite pantheon. By the way, you might have heard this god's name pronounced Baal. Technically, it's actually pronounced Baal, just for your information. The second contrast or comparison that we can make between ancient Near Eastern law codes and Israelite law was the concern for the underprivileged. In the Israelite law code, the poor were provided for. Aliens and the dispossessed were accepted into Israel, and this was not so in surrounding cultures where the poor and the lower classes were abused quite often and punishment was more harsh. For example, if you were a poor person who committed a crime and one of your partners in crime was a free person of wealth, and you had another partner in crime who was a prince or a princess, and all three of you were caught in the commission of this crime, the prince or the princess would probably get away with it without any punishment at all. The free person of some wealth and status might get fined, and you as the poor and the lower class person for the same crime might be beaten with a whip or imprisoned or something like that. So you can see that justice was handed out according to social class rather than the punishment fitting the crime. The third comparison or contrast that we can make regarding ancient Near Eastern law codes and Israelite law was the emphasis on community in Israelite law. Brother or sister were common terms of address for fellow Israelites. Israelites saw themselves as children of God, which of course is a family term, and Yahweh was viewed in parental terms. So there was this emphasis on community among the Israelites that did not exist in surrounding cultures. Now, what were the different types of law? I'm suggesting to you two different types of law. The first type was called apodictic law. Apodictic law was unconditional, and it was worded as you shall or you shall not. Apodictic law is very rare in the ancient Near Eastern law codes. In fact, it hardly occurs at all. And an example from Israelite law is, of course, the Ten Commandments, which many of them are worded in such a way that they begin, you shall not. So, for example, you have, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and that sort of thing. Like I said, very rare in the ancient Near East. The second type of law was casuistic law. This was conditional law, and it was worded as, if X happens, then let Y result. This was the most common type of law in the ancient Near East. It's also called case law because it dealt with specific cases. If you want to read examples of case law or casuistic law, just have a look at Exodus chapter 21, verses 28 to 35, and there's quite a bit of case law in the Old Testament. Now, something rather unique about Israelite law was that it also dealt with worship regulations. There was detailed guidance for preservation of rituals and observations in the Old Testament law. Priests were given the responsibility to carry out the rituals and the memorials. There were feasts, sacrifices, and offerings, and all of these pointed to Yahweh as Israel's preserver and Lord. This is an unusual feature of ancient Near Eastern law. No other culture incorporated worship into their legal material, and of course we don't do that today. If you were to read the Penal Code of the state of California, or any other state for that matter, or even federal law or local law, you will not find any guidelines for worship that are found in the Penal Code. You will find codes regarding robbery, regarding breaking and entering. You will find all kinds of other legal sections on different violations of the Penal Code, but you will not find a code on worship. So that's where the Israelites were very, very unique. Now, the fourth theme that I'm suggesting to you as the themes of the Old Testament is the theme of Exodus. The Exodus was seen as the redemptive act of God. In fact, many Old Testament writers looked back on the Exodus as the cross of the Old Testament. Old Testament writers look back on the Exodus in the same way that New Testament writers look back on the cross. The Exodus was mentioned quite often in the book of Psalms and also the prophets, especially Hosea, as evidence of God's saving power and power to deliver from danger. Later generations look back on the Exodus in remembrance, and of course the Passover was the main celebratory memorial for the Exodus. The Exodus showed what God had done and could do to redeem and rescue His people. In the New Testament, the Lord's Supper functions in much the same way. We look back on Jesus' sacrifice for us, which redeemed us and saved us from sin and eternal punishment. When we look at the Passover, it's interesting because it is based so much on the Exodus. If you were to look in Luke chapter 22 verses 14 to 20, where it talks about the Passover, we find out in verse 20 that Jesus took the cup after supper, and this particular cup was called in the Passover Seder the order of the meal that they eat during the Passover observation. It's called the cup of redemption. The cup of redemption was a cup of red wine, and Jesus interrupted the Passover Seder when He took the cup after supper, this cup of red wine that's called the cup of redemption, and He held it up to the disciples and He said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." What He was saying there is that His blood was about to bring us into a new relationship with God. Remember that I said that the word covenant essentially means relationship? So let's read Jesus' statement again. This cup is the new relationship in my blood. The cup of redemption in blood would have been associated with sacrificial language in the Exodus. And so Jesus was bringing us into a new way to relate to God, a new relationship. No longer would we have to approach God through the sacrificial system that was instituted in the book of Leviticus, but now we could approach God directly because of the death of Christ on the cross. If you would like to have more information regarding what the new covenant brought about in the new change in the relationship, read the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. It addresses that very specifically. Thank you for your attention on this topic. I appreciate it very much.